Hello everyone. So I want to make this video to discuss the idea of self-awareness, like self-understanding, cognizance, introspection, whatever we want to call it, this idea of understanding ourselves, understanding our motivation. Um, let's just call it self-awareness or cognizance. I will use those two words interchangeably. So cognizance as root cause. But let me quickly explain what I mean by root cause. So root cause is the cause that creates the other causes. So it's like you have the main cause, then you have subsequent causes followed by the main cause, and then you have at the end, let's call it the symptom. So the consequence that itself doesn't have cause. So I don't know, for example, it's not easy in general to identify the root cause because you never really know if there is a cause before it. So we could say the Big Bang is the root cause of, let's say, the universe, but in reality we don't even know. There may be something before that. Now, to some extent, of course, if you want to push it till the end, if you want to stretch it, of course we can always say the Big Bang is the root cause. But in a more pragmatic and practical way, it's like saying, for example, I don't know, someone has some disease, what is the root cause? And let's say you have some dots on your skin. Well, that's the symptom, that's not the disease. And then why you have those dots may be because of some allergy, but then why you have this allergy may be because of, I don't know, some stuff you eat or whatever. I'm not a doctor, I'm just making an example. Yeah. So the idea is, if you have some dots on your skin, well, sure, you can put some makeup to cover it, but that's not really going to solve the problem, and everyone knows that. Now you have the allergy, I don't know, maybe you can take some pill to remove the allergy, but again, that's not the root cause. So I like this example actually, so I will provide it. It's like, it's the idea of, because the concept of cause is not always easy to understand. It's sometimes we confuse cause with other stuff like manifestation, with symptom, with correlations. So it's not so easy to understand the cause. But I will give just an example, and again, I'm not a doctor, please take it just as an example. So let's say, for example, someone has, it's called scurvy. So it's a disease that is caused by lack of vitamin C. So you can really say, and there is research saying that lack of vitamin C will cause scurvy. It is well known. So if someone takes no vitamin C for too much time, they will get scurvy. And this is reasonable to say that the lack of vitamin C is the cause for the scurvy. It's reasonable because we know that we need vitamin C. That's why it's called a vitamin, because it's something essential. And we also know that our ancestors always ate vitamin C in some place or another. It's not just in oranges, it's in many things. So when you eat food, there is some vitamin C. Some food have more, some have less, but in general, there is some vitamin C. And that's the natural food that we have evolved to eat, etc., etc. So it is reasonable to believe that if we don't have enough vitamin C, I mean, of course, it's obvious that if we don't eat any vitamin C, we get this scurvy, but it's also reasonable to believe that it is the root cause. But let's make another example. Let's say that someone is depressed. Now, we cannot say that the cause is the lack of antidepressants. So that is the lack, because yes, if you take an antidepressant, just like if you take a pill of vitamin C, then he will have some vitamin C in his blood or some antidepressant in his blood. So someone could believe that it's kind of the same. They could say, well, at the end of the day, he's lacking vitamin C, so he gets scurvy. You put vitamin C in his blood, now he doesn't get scurvy. So if he's depressed, why not just give him antidepressant? And if the antidepressant solves the problem, then we can argue that the cause for the depression was lack of antidepressant. But this doesn't make sense, because it's not that we evolved to take antidepressants. It's not that our ancestors were finding antidepressants on tree. It kind of lacked the historical perspective. I mean, antidepressants were built in a factory very recently, and in some way or another they can mitigate or reduce the depression. But it's absurd to say that the cause of the depression is lack of antidepressants, whereas it's reasonable to say that the cause of the scurvy is lack of vitamin C. So, but it requires a little bit of thinking, a little bit of critical thinking, analysis, etc., etc., etc. So anyway, I hope that it's clear the concept of root cause. The root cause is the initial cause. So clearly the lack of vitamin C is the root cause of scurvy. Whereas the root cause for depression, we actually don't really know, because there are many types of depression, and so there can be many types of root cause for it. It's not always easy to find the root cause, but I will give an example. So in this example, I want to explain the concept of cognizance or self-awareness as a root cause. So what do I mean by as a root cause? So usually a root cause is, again, is the main cause, and if you can explain something by its root cause, then you don't really need any other explanation. So it's the simplest explanation. You guys can search Occam razor. It's the idea that the simpler explanation that solves more problems than it creates is usually the right one. Not always, but in general, Occam razor is a good model for finding, let's say, the best explanation for some phenomena. So let's look at at how the root cause how cognizance or self-awareness as root cause can be used to explain all behaviors, especially what we call good versus bad, and without the need to introduce extra parameters like morality and like an agent that decides what is good or what is bad, or a complicated rule, because again, morality is tricky. It's like it clearly makes everything a lot more complicated. So is it okay to steal a loaf of bread? Maybe not, because stealing is bad. But then what if you steal to feed your children? Then it's good. But what if you steal 10 tons of bread? Then it's not good. So morality is very subjective. So it's a significant overcomplication of the explanation. Explaining the behavior I'm going to describe, like the action that we undertake in terms of good and bad, explaining them in terms of morality is extremely complicated. So that's why I think we should just skip the morality, which probably is not, actually for sure is not the root cause, and look at the root cause. But let's look first at the example. Let's look first at the scenarios. So let's see first what we are going to call a good action and a bad action. Now, of course, good and bad is not very interesting, but we have to use it just for the sake of this conversation. So a good action. So why will someone do a good action? Well, of course, because they want to, or because they have to. But if they have to, it's not really interesting. They're just obligated. So let's ignore the fact, this is the case where someone is obligated. Let's look at the case where someone just wants to do a good action. Now, there are two possible cases for which they may want to do a good action. One is because it's a direct preference. They just feel good about doing it. And we are going to look at why and how it works and how it relates to cognizance and self-awareness. The other is because of a story. But let's look at the story first, which is what I'm trying to disprove, let's say, that this is not the root cause. Well, it is a root cause in itself, but so let's just look at the example. So let's say someone has an idea about their identity and they believe that they are a great guy, or that it's important to be nice, or it's important to be generous, it's important to be whatever. So they should be this, they should be that, they are this, they are that. So there is a story related to their identity or related to how the world should work according to them. And they basically want to validate that story. So they are going to do good stuff, let's say good deeds, good actions for other people, just to tell themselves, just to defend their story, to validate their story, that let's say they are great guys. Or maybe that they will go to heaven, they believe that good action will bring good karma, will bring them to heaven, or just to defend the identity. But it's always about a story, so they are doing it for the story. Now in this case, this has nothing to do with the third person. It has nothing to do with the other person that receives, let's say, whatever they give. It's kind of private. It's like between them and their story. There is nothing else. It's just something that is between them and their story. So it's purely for them. Like me, my story. The third person does not matter. The third person is just a mean to validate my story. I don't care about the person at all. I just care about validating my story. That will be the case if someone believes that, I don't know, they are a good guy, they have to do good, they are unique, they are special, they are generous, or it's important to help others, blah, blah, blah. They have built a story, they want to validate the story, so they are doing it for the story. Not for the person, they're doing it for the story. It's just about them and the story. This is for the good deed. Now let's look at the bad deed. Again, let's look first at the bad deed with the story. So the person has a story. Let's say in the case for the negative action, the story is probably more around power. So it's the idea that this guy, he has a story that, let's say, I'm big, I'm important, I'm powerful, I'm this, I'm that. And so he wants to validate this story. He wants to validate the story that say that he's powerful. And how to validate the story that he's powerful? The best way to validate the story is to basically hurt people, to kind of also see if there is going to be some repercussion. So ideally, if someone tells themselves the story that they are very powerful, they probably expect, I mean, in order to validate that story, they expect to be able to hurt others for no reason and that nothing happens to them. So it's kind of a test of how powerful they are. So they have a story that it's important to be powerful, it's important to be dominant, I'm powerful, I'm a very powerful guy, you know, blah, 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 blah. And so they have to validate that story that they're powerful. And the way they validate that story that they're powerful is basically by hurting people and expecting that there is no consequence. Just like the case of the person doing the good deed for the story, the person doing the bad deed for the story is really the same. It has nothing to do with, they are not evil in the sense that they are trying to hurt the person. They don't care about the person. It's just between them and the story. They are doing it just to validate the story. So they need to, unfortunately, they need to hurt the person just to prove to themselves that they are powerful, to validate the story that they are powerful, it's important to be powerful, blah, 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 blah. So again, it's completely private. It's between them and the story. The third person that is being hurt is just a mean to an end. It is irrelevant. It's just he was unfortunate to be there, just like the person that received the good deed. In the case of the good deed with the story, he was just lucky to be there. It's not about that person. In the case of the bad deed, it's also not about the person. It's only about the story. It's between me and my story. I believe it's important that I'm powerful, that, let's say I'm important, I'm powerful, I'm whatever. So in order to validate my story that I'm powerful, I'm going to hurt random people or even people I know, whatever. I'm going to hurt someone just to see if I can hurt him, if that he should not be able to prevent me from hurting him, and even better, if he cannot get back at me. So then I can validate my story that I'm powerful. So we can see already that when it comes to stories, there is no real difference. This is actually, I think, very interesting that there is actually no real difference between the good action and the bad action. It's really the same. It just depends on the story we have. So if we have the story that we are a good guy, we are going to do good deeds to validate that story. If we have the story that we are a powerful guy, we are going to do bad deeds to validate that story. But either way, we are just trying to validate a story. So the good or bad act is purely the consequence of what story we have. It has nothing to do with our character or our persona or anything. It's just about the stories we build. So the stories we have, we just try to validate those stories, and we have to do certain actions to validate those stories. So that case we can exclude. It's just, as we see, there is absolutely no difference between the good deed and the bad deed. It's just about the story. Depends what the story is. We are going to go to do the good deed if we have a certain story, because that story gets validated with a good deed, and we are going to do the bad deed if we have a certain story that gets validated with the bad deed. So let's get rid of the stories now, and let's look at how will it work without stories. So let's say someone has dropped the stories. They have dropped all the stories about identity, should, could, whatever. So now they still act based on their preference, but they act based on a direct preference. So usually when I say direct or indirect preference, basically direct preference means a preference without story. So let's say I prefer chocolate ice cream than vanilla ice cream. There is no story there. I just prefer chocolate than vanilla. I don't know why. It's in my brain, in my unconscious. I like chocolate. There is nothing I can do about it. So this is a direct preference. Whereas an indirect preference will be it's a preference because of a story. So I prefer to do good things because it validates my story that I'm a good person. I prefer to do bad things because it validates my story that I'm a powerful person. So this is an indirect preference. Indirect preference is, yes, we still act on our preference because at some event, I mean, why would we do anything else? I mean, we always act on our preferences unless we are forced to. Even if we put effort, effort is just really a way to do something we don't want, but it's usually because we want something even bigger after. So let's say you don't want to exercise, but you want to have big muscle, you will still exercise, but it's not that you do it against your will. Now, exercising is your preference because you really have a strong preference for big muscle, so you will still exercise. So unless we are forced to do something, we always do what we want, we always do what we prefer. The question is if the preference comes from a story or not. So the preference, ideally we want to drop the preference that come from stories because those are distorted. We are not really interacting, let's say, with reality, we are just interacting with our stories. So we are basically interacting with Santa Claus, which is less than ideal, I would say. But let's look now at someone who does not have stories anymore, someone that has dropped the conditioned mind and has no stories. So why would exactly prefer? There are the two possibilities. So why would they have a preference, a direct preference for, let's say, doing a good action to someone? Or why would they have a preference to do a bad action, a bad deed, a good deed versus bad deed to someone? Because, of course, we understand now why they will do that if there is a story, but why would they do it if there is no story? Well, let's look at it now. So if there is no story, then it's really about self-awareness, cognizance, etc. That's why I say it's the root cause. You don't need the morality, etc., etc. You just need to understand that cognizance and self-awareness is the root cause. So let's look from this root cause perspective as cognizance and self-awareness being the root cause. Why would you do something good for someone else? So let's say you are the giver, but you have a strong self-awareness because you're not blinded by the stories. So you can see things for what they, well, not really for what they actually are, but you can see things more clearly because it's not blurred by the stories. So you can see things more clearly. And if you have a certain degree of self-awareness, not only you can understand yourself and your motivations better, but you probably can also relate to others better. You can put yourself in their place, put yourself in their shoes, imagine how they feel, imagine what they think. You can kind of imagine being at their place. And if you can imagine being at their place, and let's say you as the giver, you give them something that is going to make them very happy, you can imagine that happiness. And in some way, imagining the happiness that the other person that you gave to is experiencing, it makes you happy. Because imagining happiness, of course, it's less intense. So the person who is receiving is feeling more happiness than you. So because you are giving, and that may give you joy or happiness as a giver. The other person as a receiver will also receive joy or happiness because they receive. But because of you have removed the stories. So instead of just looking at yourself and your story, it's not just between you and your stories. Instead of just looking only at you and your stories, now you can also look at others, and you can kind of connect with others. So you can imagine how they feel when they receive. So not only you may feel happy to give because just like that, it could be a direct preference, but you can also have enough empathy, you can have enough connection, you can imagine, you can, because of your self-awareness and the fact that you remove the stories, now it's not just about you and the story. So you can really imagine how the person is feeling. And by imagining that the person is feeling really happy, you also feel happy because it's like remembering something good is not, of course, it's not the same as experiencing it, but it's still a little bit similar. There is some, it's less intense, but it's a happy memory. I mean, people like to remember a happy memory. So just like you like to taste a delicious food, you also like to remember tasting the delicious food. This is the same. So it's like if you give something to someone and that makes them really happy, of course they are super happy. But imagining how happy they are, it still makes you happy a little bit. But to experience this, you must have removed the stories, because if you have the stories, it's just about you and how great you are. It's between you and your stories. When you remove the stories, Now it's you have enough self-awareness to imagine how the other person is feeling, and you can feel a little bit of what they are feeling. So that's why you will do the good deed. The only cause is the removal of the stories, which reduce our self-awareness, and the ability to imagine how they feel, which is an increase of self-awareness, the ability to be more aware of reality or whatever surrounds us. So it increases our awareness or cognition. It increases our ability to understand not only our motivations, but the implications of our actions. So we become more self-aware of us, but also of the implication of our actions on top of the implication of our action for others. And also we become better at imagining maybe how they feel. So this will be cognizance as the root cause for a good deed. You do not need morality. You don't need any big stories about how great you are or being generous or it's better to do this or it's better to do that. You really do something just because you can imagine how the person that receives it is going to feel, and you can feel a little bit of it. Cognizance as the root cause and not story as the cause. But now let's look also for a bad deed. So how, in that case, lack of cognizance as a root cause, how can it, without a story, create, build the desire to hurt someone? Well, I will argue that if someone is feeling really miserable, usually because they have a lot, this is a little bit confusing, because in theory, if they have low cognizance and low self-awareness, they also have stories. So the example of someone that doesn't have stories, so doesn't have conditioned mind, but has high self-awareness, it kind of doesn't really exist. But still, I want to give this example, even if it doesn't perfectly fit. And the example is, even if we remove the story, which again usually doesn't really make sense, because the person with low self-awareness and low cognizance usually has the stories. But even if we remove the stories, there will be potentially a direct incentive for hurting other people. And it will be the fact that if you feel really miserable, let's say because of very low cognizance and very low self-awareness and having so many stories of so many kinds, you feel really miserable, it may make sense to hurt others just to feel that at least you're not alone in your suffering. Yes, you're miserable, but hey, those other people are also miserable. And that gives you a little bit of extra joy. Not much, but a little bit. So instead of saying, I'm the only one who is miserable, now you say, well, I'm miserable, but other people are also miserable. So by making them miserable, you kind of feel less miserable by contrast, something like this. So again, we fall again into the situation of cognizance and self-awareness as root cause. So I think it's interesting. I hope you guys find it interesting. This idea that it's really the degree of cognizance and of self-awareness that is going to determine the kind of actions we do, and for a very specific reason and without the need for stories. There is no need for morality. There is no need for believing in some universal justice. There is no need to believe in karma. There is no need to believe in reward and punishment or any of those things. It's just completely natural. The root cause of cognizance can produce, if someone has a high degree of cognizance and self-awareness, it's just natural. It's just a side effect. It's just the symptom. It will naturally produce people that want to do good things to others because they can imagine how the other person feels, and that makes them feel good. And if someone feels miserable because of very low degree of cognizance and self-awareness, even without story, which again is unlikely because most likely they have a lot of stories, but even without stories, it would explain why they will desire to hurt others, because if they are already feeling miserable, at least they will feel a little bit less miserable, thinking that now they are not alone feeling miserable, but other people also feel miserable.